Hans Jeschonnek was once the shining star of Hitler's Luftwaffe. Intelligent, disciplined, and fiercely loyal, he climbed the ranks faster than almost anyone else in Nazi Germany's armed forces. But behind his meteoric rise lay the seeds of a tragedy that would end not only his career but also his life. Born on April 9, 1899, in Inno-Fraflav, then part of the German Empire, Jeschonnek grew up in a family rooted in military tradition. His father was an army officer, and from an early age, Hans was expected to follow the same path. At just 14, he entered a cadet school in Naumburg, where he was molded by Prussian discipline, order, and an unshakable belief in service to the state. When World War I erupted, Jeschonnek was still in training. By 1916, barely 17, he joined the German army as an artillery cadet. The artillery branch demanded precision, technical skill, and mathematical rigor, all of which suited the young officer. As the war dragged on, Jeschonnek developed an interest in aviation, then still an experimental field. In 1918, he began flight training, but Germany's defeat ended his chance to see action as a pilot. Like many officers of his generation, Jeschonnek faced an uncertain future after the war. The Treaty of Versailles had dismantled Germany's air force, banned military aviation, and reduced the army to a fraction of its former size. Still, Jeschonnek managed to remain in the drastically downsized Reichswehr, a testament to his promise and intellect. In the 1920s, when Germany secretly began rebuilding its military power, Jeschonnek became involved in covert aviation projects. Under secret agreements with the Soviet Union, German pilots and engineers trained on Russian soil, defying Versailles restrictions. These clandestine operations became the cradle of the future Luftwaffe. Jeschonnek, with his technical precision and unwavering ambition, was among the select few preparing for Germany's eventual return to the skies. The rise of the Nazi Party in 1933 changed everything. With Hitler in power and rearmament in full swing, Jeschonnek's career accelerated. In 1935, when the Luftwaffe was officially unveiled, he transferred from the army to the new air service. His blend of discipline, intellect, and loyalty caught the attention of senior commanders. One of his early patrons was General Walter Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff. Wever was a visionary who believed in long-range strategic bombing and saw in Jeschonnek a gifted young officer with enormous potential. The two men formed a close professional bond. But when Wever died in a plane crash in 1936, Jeschonnek lost both his mentor and his guiding influence. Despite this setback, his rise continued. In 1937, at only 38 years old, Jeschonnek was appointed Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, an astonishing promotion that made him one of the youngest generals in the entire German military. Many senior officers were stunned, but Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, trusted Jeschonnek's intellect and energy. To Göring, he represented the new generation of officers who would lead Germany's air arm into modern warfare. As Chief of Staff, Jeschonnek became one of the most influential figures in shaping Luftwaffe doctrine. He worked closely with Ernst Udet, the flamboyant World War I ace responsible for technical development. The two men could not have been more different. Udet was impulsive and emotional. Jeschonnek was analytical and rigid. Yet together, they helped define how the Luftwaffe would fight. Jeschonnek believed in tactical air power, short, sharp strikes in direct support of ground forces. He opposed Wever's earlier concept of the Ural bomber, a fleet of heavy, long-range bombers designed to strike deep into enemy territory. To him, Germany's resources were too limited for such grand designs. Instead, he championed dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka and medium bombers that could devastate enemy defenses and support blitzkrieg operations. In the early campaigns of World War II, his ideas seemed vindicated. During the invasion of Poland in 1939, Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed airfields, shattered communications, and paralyzed enemy logistics. The same formula brought success in Norway, the Low Countries, and France. By mid-1940, the world regarded the Luftwaffe as invincible. But beneath the triumphs lay cracks that would soon split. Wide open. The Luftwaffe had no true long-range bombers, and its aircraft were designed for quick victories, not prolonged wars. These flaws became painfully clear when Germany turned its attention to Britain. As the Battle of Britain began, Jeschonnek's doctrine faced its first major test. Initially, the Luftwaffe inflicted heavy damage, but as the campaign dragged on, the limitations of his strategy became evident. German bombers lacked range, armor, and coordination. When Göring shifted tactics to bomb London instead of military targets, Jeschonnek defended the decision, but deep down he knew the Luftwaffe was outmatched. The failure to defeat Britain marked the beginning of his long descent, one that would mirror the Luftwaffe's own. Hans Jeschonnek's life began in the shadow of barracks walls and parade grounds. Born on April 9, 1899, in Innerauslach, then part of the German Empire's province of Posen, he grew up in a world where discipline, hierarchy, and obedience were the natural order of things. His father, a military officer, ensured young Hans would follow the same path. From childhood, the rhythm of marching boots and the echo of commands were as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. At 14, while most boys were discovering the joys of youth, Hans entered the cadet school at Naumburg, an institution designed not to nurture imagination, but to shape perfect officers for the Kaiser's army. The boys were hardened by cold, hunger, and strict discipline. Punishments were harsh, praise was rare, and individuality was discouraged. Yet, within this austere environment, Jeschonnek excelled. His instructors noted his quiet intelligence, his precision, and his near-fanatical sense of duty. When war erupted in 1914, the cadets were electrified. The Great War seemed like an opportunity for glory, a proving ground for a generation raised to believe in service to the fatherland. But by the time Jeschonnek graduated and joined the army as an officer cadet in 1916, the romantic vision of war had long vanished. The Western Front was now a graveyard of youth and hope. Assigned first to the artillery, Jeschonnek quickly revealed a rare aptitude for the technical and mathematical aspects of modern warfare. He understood trajectory, timing, and the mechanical rhythm of destruction. But even as he served loyally, the war around him was changing. Airplanes, once dismissed as fragile curiosities, were transforming battle itself. Observation balloons, reconnaissance flights, and strafing runs were altering the very concept of warfare. And Jeschonnek, always curious, found himself drawn toward the skies. In the final years of the war, he trained as a pilot, though the armistice arrived before he could see meaningful action. Still, that exposure to aviation left an indelible mark. The sky represented a new frontier, one of precision, technology, and intellectual mastery. For a man like Jeschonnek, obsessed with structure and control, the air offered both freedom and order. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Germany lay humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles forbade her from maintaining an air force. The Kaiser was gone, the empire dismantled. The army, now the Reichswehr, was cut down to a mere 100,000 men. Thousands of officers were dismissed. But Jeschonnek, disciplined and technically capable, was among the lucky few retained. He stayed in the artillery through the early 1920s, a period when the German military was forced underground, stripped of its prestige, yet secretly plotting revival. These years tested not just loyalty, but creativity. Officially, Germany was forbidden from developing aircraft. Unofficially, it did so in secret. Through covert agreements with the Soviet Union, German officers trained pilots and tested designs at hidden bases near Lipetsk. It was here, far from the eyes of Allied inspectors, that the seeds of the future Luftwaffe were sown, and Jeschonnek was among those entrusted with this forbidden knowledge. He proved to be the perfect kind of soldier for such a shadowy task: intelligent, discreet, and unquestioning. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't talk. His life revolved entirely around service. Those who knew him later described a man of chilling focus, almost mechanical in his dedication. A colleague once remarked, "Jeschonnek didn't just follow orders, he became the order itself." By the early 1930s, as Germany shifted under the rise of the National Socialist movement, the secret preparations of men like Jeschonnek began to pay off. The new regime sought to restore military pride, and it needed men who had already been preparing for years in silence. When the Luftwaffe was officially unveiled in 1935, Jeschonnek transitioned seamlessly into the new Air Force. He was still young, barely in his mid-30s, but his technical grasp and absolute discipline impressed his superiors. Among those who noticed him was General Walter Wever, the first Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe. Wever was a visionary, one of the few German officers to understand that air power would determine the wars of the future. He saw in Jeschonnek not just a loyal subordinate, but a kindred spirit, a man of intellect and order. Wever made him part of his inner circle, giving him a voice in the early shaping of Luftwaffe doctrine. Then, in June 1936, tragedy struck. Wever was killed in a plane crash, his aircraft running out of fuel on takeoff, slamming into the ground outside Dresden. His death left a gaping void at the heart of the young Luftwaffe. The man who had dreamed of a balanced air force, capable of both tactical support and strategic bombing, was gone, and with him much of the long-term vision. For Jeschonnek, Wever's death was both a personal and professional shock. He lost a mentor, but also found opportunity. Within a year, through sheer competence and the favor of influential allies like Hermann Göring, he rose rapidly through the ranks. In February 1937, at just 38 years old, Hans Jeschonnek was appointed Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, the youngest general in the entire German military establishment. To many, his promotion seemed almost absurd, a boy among veterans. But Göring, impressed by Jeschonnek's discipline and mathematical precision, believed he had found the perfect man to turn the Luftwaffe into a machine of efficiency and control. Jeschonnek, for his part, accepted the role with his usual cold calmness. He had no doubt, no hesitation. His life had prepared him for this moment. He was now standing at the center of the Nazi war machine, young, brilliant, and utterly devoted. The sky, which once represented freedom, was now his battlefield. And as Europe edged toward war, Hans Jeschonnek would find that the discipline and perfection that once defined his rise would soon become the weight that dragged him down. When the Luftwaffe revealed itself to the world in 1935, it was more than just a new military branch. It was a symbol of rebirth. The Third Reich had turned defiance into spectacle, and the roar of German aircraft became the sound of national resurrection. In this moment of patriotic euphoria, Hans Jeschonnek stood at the nerve center of it all, young, brilliant, and utterly devoted to his duty. As Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, Jeschonnek had two powerful men above him, Hermann Göring, the bombastic Reichsmarschall, and Ernst Udet, the former World War I ace who embodied the reckless charm of early aviation. Göring represented political power and propaganda. Udet represented instinct and flair. Between them, Jeschonnek was the cold, calculating mind, the architect of structure and doctrine. He was not charismatic, nor did he seek public attention. To many of his peers, he was distant, a man who spoke little, thought constantly, and demanded perfection. His staff described him as precise to the point of inhumanity. But that precision, that obsession with efficiency, was exactly what Göring believed would make the Luftwaffe unstoppable. A new doctrine for a new war. Jeschonnek's philosophy of air warfare was rooted in his experiences from the 1920s, practical, tactical, and ruthlessly efficient. He rejected the dream of a long-range strategic bomber fleet championed by his late mentor, General Wever. Instead, he believed air power should serve the army directly, destroying enemy communications, paralyzing movement and striking with speed. It was a doctrine built for blitzkrieg, fast, coordinated, and devastating. In Jeschonnek's words, written in one of his internal memos, "The purpose of the Luftwaffe is not to fight the war alone. It is to make victory on the ground inevitable." He saw the air arm as a weapon of precision, not of annihilation. But of coordination. To him, victory meant synchronization. The exact moment when bombs fell, tanks advanced, and artillery fired in perfect harmony. It was war as engineering. This doctrine was efficient, flexible, and, in the early years, frighteningly effective. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, it was Jeschonnek's Luftwaffe that opened the assault. German aircraft shattered communications, destroyed airfields, and crushed resistance before the ground troops even arrived. Within weeks, the campaign was over. The world watched in disbelief. The speed of the conquest, the unity between air and land seemed like something new, something terrifying. Blitzkrieg had been born, and Jeschonnek's fingerprints were all over it. As one British intelligence officer later wrote, "The Germans did not merely attack, they orchestrated destruction, the peak of power." Through 1940, the Luftwaffe was at the height of its might. Jeschonnek's strategies drove Germany's rapid victories across Europe. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France all fell in a cascade of lightning campaigns. The Luftwaffe bombed bridges, cut railway lines, and destroyed entire columns of retreating forces. Soldiers on the ground began to believe the Air Force could do anything. Inside the Führer's headquarters, Jeschonnek's reputation grew. Hitler saw him as a genius of efficiency, the young mastermind of modern warfare. Göring, too, basked in the reflected glory, though he barely understood the technical details. The press celebrated the Luftwaffe as the sharpest sword of the Reich. And at its core was Hans Jeschonnek, the quiet general with icy eyes who rarely smiled and rarely slept. But behind the victories, fault lines were already forming. The Luftwaffe had been designed for short, concentrated wars, not prolonged ones. Germany lacked the industrial capacity for heavy bombers or long-range missions. The doctrine that had crushed Poland and France was ill-suited for the next challenge, Britain. The turning of the tide. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe prepared for the Battle of Britain, Jeschonnek believed his tactics would once again deliver swift victory. His planning was meticulous. Destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground, cripple radar stations, and then clear the skies for invasion. But the RAF refused to die. Despite early successes, the Germans underestimated Britain's radar system, its home field advantage, and the sheer will of its pilots. Losses mounted. When Göring, under pressure from Hitler, shifted focus from airfields to cities, ordering the bombing of London, Jeschonnek protested. He argued that the strategic shift made no sense. It would not win air superiority. But Göring overruled him. And so, for the first time, Hans Jeschonnek's logical precision clashed with Nazi politics and lost. The Blitz began. London burned. Civilians died. But the RAF endured. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,700 aircraft and thousands of its best pilots. For the first time, Germany had been stopped. The myth of invincibility was broken. Cracks beneath the surface. Inside the Luftwaffe High Command, the defeat in Britain exposed deeper flaws. Jeschonnek's doctrine, optimized for short campaigns, had left the Air Force without long-range capability. Germany had no strategic bombers to hit industrial centers, no replacement system to sustain losses. Some generals began to whisper that Weaver's death years before had doomed them all, that Jeschonnek's rejection of the Ural bomber concept had crippled the Luftwaffe from within. Jeschonnek, humiliated but still devoted, refused to yield. He blamed logistics, not strategy. He threw himself into planning the next campaign, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, believing that success in the East would erase the failure in the West. But deep inside, the perfectionist began to fracture. He slept less, worked longer, and isolated himself from nearly everyone except Göring. The two men's relationship grew toxic, mutual dependence laced with resentment. Göring needed Jeschonnek's intellect. Jeschonnek needed Göring's protection. As 1941 approached, the Luftwaffe stood ready again, vast, confident, and dangerous. Jeschonnek's plans for the Eastern Campaign gleamed with his characteristic precision. Strike hard, strike fast, and these could cripple Soviet air power in the first 72 hours. But the vastness of Russia would soon prove that even the most brilliant doctrine could not control chaos. The perfection Jeschonnek had built his life upon was about to collapse, under the weight of a war that refused to obey his equations. By 1942, Hans Jeschonnek's once brilliant mind was trapped in a machine that no longer worked. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, was breaking under the weight of its own contradictions. Too few planes, too little fuel, too many fronts. And at the center of it all stood Jeschonnek, still trying to make the impossible function. At first, the war in the East had seemed to vindicate him. In the summer of 1941, Luftwaffe formations swept across the Soviet Union, destroying thousands of Red Air Force planes in the first weeks. German pilots claimed supremacy over the skies. The Blitzkrieg once again appeared unstoppable. But the Soviet Union was not Poland. It was endless, its factories far beyond the range of German bombers, its people willing to fight to the last man. As the Wehrmacht advanced deeper into the steppe, the Luftwaffe found itself stretched beyond capacity. Airfields were primitive, maintenance was nearly impossible, and losses mounted. The further east they flew, the thinner the air became, both literally and logistically. Jeschonnek watched his beautifully crafted system unravel in slow motion. He tried to adapt, reorganizing supply lines, issuing desperate memoranda about fuel shortages, warning that the Luftwaffe must not be treated as a limitless resource. But no one listened. Göring promised Hitler miracles. Hitler demanded results. And Jeschonnek, bound by loyalty and perfectionism, kept trying to deliver them. The burden of Stalingrad. Then came the disaster that defined him. In late 1942, as the German Sixth Army became trapped at Stalingrad, Hitler ordered that the troops be supplied entirely by air. Göring, either delusional or desperate to preserve his prestige, assured the Führer that it could be done. Jeschonnek knew it was impossible. The Luftwaffe didn't have the aircraft, the weather was catastrophic, and the distances were immense. But his sense of duty betrayed him. He obeyed. Day after day, transport pilots flew into the frozen inferno, often never returning. Jeschonnek's headquarters was flooded with casualty reports: aircraft lost, crews missing, fuel depots bombed. The airlift, meant to be heroic, became a slow-motion suicide. When the Sixth Army finally surrendered, the Luftwaffe had lost over 500 planes and thousands of men. The myth of its efficiency died in the snow of Stalingrad. Historians would later call it the moment when Jeschonnek broke. He had followed orders that he knew were wrong. His perfectionism, the same quality that once made him brilliant, now became his torment. In private, he began to admit that the Luftwaffe structure was crumbling, that Göring's leadership was a house of cards. But publicly, he could not rebel. To criticize Göring was to defy Hitler himself. Enemies within. By 1943, the situation inside the Luftwaffe's high command had become poisonous. Erhard Milch, Göring's deputy and head of armaments, despised Jeschonnek. Milch accused him of poor planning, of clinging to outdated doctrine, of living in a fantasy world while German cities burned. Jeschonnek, in turn, saw Milch as a bureaucrat obsessed with production figures, a man who didn't understand the art of war. Their feud became legendary. Meetings devolved into shouting matches. Göring, instead of mediating, fanned the flames, playing his subordinates against each other to maintain control. Every failure, every air raid, every downed bomber became an opportunity for blame. And the blame, more often than not, fell on Jeschonnek. Outside, the world was collapsing. Allied bombers had begun the Battle of the Ruhr, devastating the industrial heart of Germany. Hamburg burned for days in the summer of 1943, a firestorm that killed over 40,000 people. When the Führer demanded explanations, Göring turned on his protégé, claiming Jeschonnek had mismanaged the defenses. For the man who had once built the Luftwaffe's foundations, it was unbearable. The breaking point. By mid-August 1943, Jeschonnek was a ghost of the officer he had once been. He barely slept, he chain-smoked, drank coffee, and worked constantly. Until dawn. His staff noticed the tremor in his hands. He had begun to mutter to himself, replaying conversations, reliving failures. The night of August 17, 18 sealed his fate. That day, American bombers struck Regensburg and Schweinfurt, crippling Germany's aircraft and ball-bearing production. Hours later, the RAF launched Operation Hydra, attacking Peenemünde, the secret V-weapon research site. The Luftwaffe's defenses failed completely. In the chaos, German anti-aircraft crews even shot down their own fighters. When Jeschonnek received the reports, something inside him seemed to snap. Witnesses said he stared at the casualty lists in silence for a long time. Then, without a word, he left his office. That evening, he returned to his quarters in Zossen. His aide found him sitting at his desk, writing rapidly. In his note, Jeschonnek wrote, "I can no longer work together with the Reichsmarschall. Long live the Führer." Moments later, he shot himself with his service pistol. He was 44 years old. Aftermath. His death stunned the Luftwaffe. Göring, horrified and desperate to control the narrative, ordered a state funeral in Berlin. The ceremony was grand but hollow. Few officers spoke of him afterward. To the Nazi leadership, his suicide was an embarrassment, another sign of weakness in a regime obsessed with strength. But among his colleagues, there was quiet grief. Many saw in Jeschonnek not a villain, but a victim, a man trapped by loyalty, crushed between his own ideals and the madness of the system he served. He had tried to make chaos obey logic, to build an air force that could win every battle. But in the end, the machine he built consumed him. Historians remain divided. Some see him as one of the most gifted staff officers of his generation, a soldier undone by politics. Others condemn his blind loyalty and refusal to confront the moral collapse of the regime. Perhaps both are true. In the silence after his death, the Luftwaffe continued its downward spiral. Within 2 years, the skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. By 1945, Göring was a prisoner, the Reich in ruins, and the air force that had once promised domination lay scattered in a cheese. Hans Jeschonnek's story is more than a biography. It is a cautionary tale, a reminder that brilliance without courage and discipline without conscience can become a prison. The perfectionist who once dreamed of order found only destruction. And as the ruins of the Reich burned beneath him, his life became a mirror of the Luftwaffe itself, brilliant, flawed, and doomed to fall from the very skies it once ruled.